look, I know she got her justice in the end, but the fact they built up her character for so long in those first episodes just to underdeliver so terribly makes me so upset, and I hope you can understand where I'm coming from. Alright guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Now that I got my amateurly rushed opinion-based tier list out of the way, it's time to move on to a tier list based on the writing of the episodes. So since I'm basing these off writing, I'm going to go off some general criteria that I'm going to use. Character writing, character interactions, if the episode keeps the audience's attention, if there's a balance of action and character interactions, the jokes and the horror, since it is a horror comedy, and if it accomplished what it needed to based on where it is in the series. I'm going to try to get through these decently quickly to not make this video too long, and I'm again going to be moving in chronological order, so starting with episode 1. I'm also going to start each episode with a quick recap of my opinion because that video kind of sucked, so I just want to fly through that. So I ranked episode 1 4th of all 8 episodes, and I put it in the top of B tier. Solid episode overall. The one major downside was obviously the humor and a little bit the animation, but it was a really solid episode. Great introduction, great hook. All right, on to writing. So episode 1's writing was actually great the more I think about it. It served as a good introduction to Uzi. It set her up as the outcast who even's got dad issues, who's lacking a mother figure, and is trying to change the way people see her. So she builds a railgun, shows it off to the class, and it still doesn't work, so she's going to find the Murdrone's lair to seek her last part. Pretty basic, pretty straightforward, good setup of the main character. Next we see, obviously in the beginning, the teacher. Teacher's a good background character who has some good comedy relief, and I think his jokes are pretty good in my opinion. Where you see Uzi's dad, Khan. He's set up and displayed well as a dad who's a little bit oblivious to his child's wants and needs, but has a bit of a controversial moment, with the door shutting on Uzi, that honestly is very misunderstood for. The more you think about his situation, he did what he felt was right. Gives the character moral complexity the more you think about it. There's Thad, who is set up as a good background character, who shows kindness to Uzi, one of the only people to do it. W. Thad. We get an introduction into V's character as someone who's uncaring and callous. It's a good intro to her facade and really tricks the viewers into thinking they understand her when they don't. We get to see N, who's the saint, who's a nice guy just like Thad, but has good sense of reason and will take things into question, like when Uzi introduces the idea that maybe J.C. Jensen is not using them for what they think they're being used for, and yeah, he has motivations beyond just being nice, unlike that. Finally, there's Jay. While she may have flopped as a character throughout this series, she absolutely shined in this episode. This was her episode. Her obnoxious, aggressive, and egotistical personality is so hateable and works so well as the main antagonist of this episode. So by setting up each and every one of these characters, I believe this episode did a fantastic job at setting up the cast for the series. This episode also set a great setting with the winter toxic death storm outside and the cold mechanical feeling of the bunker. The exposition is great in the beginning. It sets up the plot well and also hooks the viewer. The pacing is at its all-time best, and the action scenes are exciting without taking up the whole episode. Overall, the only main negative I can find with the writing is the humor. Jokes are very poorly written in this episode, but it keeps the viewer's attention. It has a good hook, and all around, I think, since it's a pilot episode, it introduced characters well, sets up a story, pretty easy to follow. It does literally exactly what you want out of a first episode of a series, so for writing, S tier. Episode 2. I had the lowest opinion of all episodes in episode 2. I put it in the bottom of C tier. Just a not exciting episode, very forgettable. Had good horror, but outside of that, just didn't do much. For the writing, it's also mixed. So as far as characters, we get to see a bit of development in Khan defending his daughter, like in the parent-teacher conference, and maybe he starts to show a bit of regret for his actions in episode 1. Teacher, I still find hilarious as comedic relief. We get to see Uzi and En's friendship grow. Lizzie and Doll are seen for the first time in greater detail, and I really love both their characters, so that's cool. Nothing like crazy about the characters. I guess we get introduced to Uzi's solver. Good way to kick off the actual plot of the series, and of course V still being a little bit unhinged. But here's the problematic part. Thad. He just has too much screen time for what he does. So don't get me wrong, I don't hate Thad as a side character. He would make an outstanding side character. The reason I say this is because his whole personality is just being nice. This is why that is a problem. In general, I tend to think I'm a pretty nice guy, and I just don't have it in me to be mean to other people most of the time, just like Thad. However, I still have motivations, wants, and things that drive me forward. Thad seems to just be nice and only does things to be nice. He never develops a personality beyond this, and Elrond is just a static character. He has no goals or motivations that we can really see, and so he's just boring. So, since they kind of like set him up as this main character guy with being like a third person of the trio of Uzi, En, and Thad, it just doesn't work. And also, with the amount of screen time is given, he just doesn't do anything with it. His role in the episode culminates to being bringing Uzi the railgun, telling her Jay's corpse crawled off, proceeds to go inside with him, get dragged away into the darkness, and uses a hologram, cut down, and then he leaves. Like, think about the amount of time he was on the screen in this episode and how little he actually contributed. It was just useless. And with how hollow his character is, I just find that a really big, glaring hole in the writing. So there's ups and downs with the characters in this episode. However, I do think this episode did a good job in introducing the change in plot to the solver being the big mystery, introducing the real twist to the story. Horror elements, top tier. Some of the best they were throughout the entire episode or series in this episode. My only other problem is that there's just a lack of action in general, and the action that did exist wasn't great. The fight against the Jay spooky snake crab wasn't that exciting, and all around made for just a forgettable and boring episode. For the second episode of an indie animation, though, it did expand on the plot like most episode 2s need to, since honestly, in indie animation, episode 1s probably need to be more general and appealing to see if people are interested enough to continue the show. So, it accomplished what it needed to for being in episode 2, but it just wasn't interesting enough, and the character writing wasn't solid enough for me to give it a super high tier. So while it was solid but not great, I'm just going to stick it in B. Episode 3. Peakening. S tier. All you need to know about my opinion. So this is also obviously where the series hooked a ton of people. The Peakening, sorry, I gotta treat it properly, is one of the other episodes I would argue is in contention for best written. The horror aspect is immediately relevant with Doll killing one of the prom queen people running for prom queen at the beginning. I forget who she killed. Great hook into the episode. Loved that. It just introduced her as an interesting character. Many people loved Doll. She was well written in this episode. Her motivation to kill V is a goal we as the audience can understand and relate to, since she lost her parents to the murder drones. I also love the V development in this episode, where she starts to not only be introduced as the third member of the main trio, but starts to have like a change of heart and killing all the workers, as shown in the prom scene. She accepts being made the prom queen instead of immediately murdering everyone, and then like shows restraint after she shoots Doll. She like talks to Uzi and En and works with them in Doll's apartment. This kind of just implies she might not be as insane as we were first led to believe, and sort of starts her redemption arc. The En and Uzi friendship continues to grow in this episode as well, and them at the prom is really cute. We see Uzi unlock her solver ability at the end of the episode. This gives her some development. Love Lizzie in this episode. Great comedic relief. One of my favorite background characters in the entire series. Plays the classic popular high school girl role so well. Love her voice actor too. Great work. The setting of the prom is one of the best things in the entire show, in my opinion. The fight was well written and entertaining. It gave hints about the Solver's power with Doll, had a banger soundtrack, although I'm not ranking the episodes based off of that, obviously. The action at the end of the episode really just pays off the build up to it throughout the entire thing. It's well paced, the jokes are funny, and it's the third episode of a series, and this third episode just needs to start to pick up the actual plot, and I think this episode did that well. The Solver's well expanded on, and we're given what ends up to be an anti-hero Doll. We get new character goals with them, wanting to learn about the Solver. Oh, and before I forget, we see Tessa and Jay reappear at the end, leaving us with questions and wanting more. It was just spectacular writing. Really develops the horror comedy aspect well. I just don't really have any problems with the way this one was written. Except for Thad. Literally doesn't do anything in this episode, which wastes his whole setup in the previous episode, as I was saying. So, but outside of that, I literally, genuinely don't have anything super negative to say. So I'm gonna also stick this one in S tier. I am gonna leave it behind episode 1 though, because I do genuinely believe episode 1 was possibly the best written one for what it needed to do. Episode 4. This is by far the most filler of all of the Murder Drones episodes, and as far as writing, since this is an 8-episode series, you can't really afford much filler. The reason I call this episode filler is because the first half of the episodes, it sets up that they're like chasing Doll or whatever to the camp. However, ultimately this culminates to absolutely nothing, as Doll gets 5 seconds of screen time where she appears behind Uzi, 0 voice lines, and just dips. Besides the first half of the episode being pointless and boring, it also just doesn't add much to the story. At this point, each episode should be progressing the story farther, and this one just didn't do that. The only relevant story-related thing that mattered was the key bug. It also technically gave us a zombie drones tape, but that was a bit of a letdown as it was just a small lore drop. It also, I guess, gave us Feral Uzi, so she got her wings and tail, but that's kind of a small thing. And I also don't really understand the point of Feral Uzi, because it gave us V name-dropping Sin, but we never see the Feral Solver behavior again, so I don't really understand the point of that. My point is, this episode just needed to really start progressing the story and continue the progression that episode 3 started, but all it really did was introduce the key bug, and it just didn't do enough. And the key bug itself was just tossed aside after episode 6. It's just, you gotta do more with the limited time you have, Liam. For characters, at least N finally stood up for himself in this episode. We got a little bit more Uzi the Outcast stuff, but still not a lot of development besides her getting wings and a tail. B continues to show her fear of the past, which continues her setup of her character, and maybe we get to see a really cool thing with why V is scared of the past in episode, so that would be great. Lizzie continues to be great comedic relief. The character action interactions were pretty good. The episode was a little bit slow in the beginning, could have been a little bit better paced. The jokes were okay at times, not great at others. But unfortunately, because this episode just didn't add anything to the show, and it's only an 8-episode show that had problems with the finale, this writing was just not good. Not at all what it needed to be. So, since it was so filler, I'm going to have to give it a D tier. Alright, episode 5. I put this in C tier, in my opinions. I put it just above episode 2. It was in 7th place. Not a great episode. It, in episode 2, lacked the most action, which is why I disliked them the most. Just, Crozy sucked. I don't know. Wasn't a great episode. But, writing, it's only slightly better. It's, if better at all, than where I put it, in my opinion. Because the middle of this series, episodes 4 and 5, are definitely 2 of the weaker episodes when it comes to writing. A certain YouTuber might overhate on this episode a little bit. Episode 5 does have some good characters. We get Sin, who's introduced. She's really interesting. Sets up a sick villain. Has a really cool personality that a lot of people get obsessed over. We get to see the Jay and Tessa relationship. And I think that was really well written. It shows Jay's loyalty as one of her defining character qualities. We also get to see a little of N with Tessa as well, and to see how Tessa cares for N, and how this care kind of transfers to Sin, therefore also kind of liking N because she wants to be just like Tessa. The Elliots, Tessa's parents, James and Louise, I think. Sorry, I can't always remember everyone's names on the spot, but they act as like good implied abusive parents. They're well written. Um, so overall, most of the characters in the episode were pretty good until we run into two in particular that ruin everything: V and Crozy. V has been set up for the entire series as being the character who's afraid of the past. V, it seemed like this would be a really big episode for her. V had like 3 voice lines and a terrible joke with a chainsaw hand at the end. V did nothing. If you cannot see why that's a problem, I don't know, go get some help. Crozy was also a big issue. Instead of just seeing what had actually happened and showing the events of the past and what could have been a really horrifying episode, Crozy came in, ruining a bunch of really high tension scenes with bad jokes, and just interfered in what places where she didn't need to be. All so Glitch could get a plush. It's just, I don't know. It was a waste of screen time. Outside of these two characters, the other glaring problem with this episode is that there's no action. This is the episode most lacking in action, and it definitely screws with how interesting the episode is to the viewer. Failing to keep the viewer's attention is bad writing. On top of this, I think this episode should be one of the scariest and darkest, considering how the context is Sin is massacring a Gala. However, a certain YouTuber that may overhate this episode might be entirely right about this. One thing, the jokes destroy every bit of tension in this episode. It's every time tension is building in a scene, it just immediately gets destroyed by a bad joke. It ruins the vibe of the episode and just makes it so unserious. So while this episode does have some pretty good characters, the jokes are awful, ruins the horror, so that the horror comedy part screws itself here. There's no action, and just, I don't know, some of the character interactions, even like Crozy and interactions, are just bad. It was basically just used as a way to set up Sin as the real main villain, which might also be a problem, setting her up this late in the series. The only other thing it really did was give NNV as Uzi's administrators and gave the key bug to Doll to set up episode 6 beginning, but it just didn't advance the plot as much as it probably needed to. However, since some of the characters did shine really well, and it did at least advance the plot a little bit, I'm going to give it C, bottom of C tier, instead of D tier. But anything else in C tier is going to go above it. Because at least it wasn't just literally filler, like episode 4 was in D tier. Episode 6, I gave this A tier. I think I ranked it 3rd, in my opinion, tier list. Really great episode, really exciting, interesting. Great soundtracks. V Sacrifice was really bad cliffhanger I got left off on the first time I watched this show a year ago. And yeah, after 2 consecutive not very well written episodes though, episode 6 picks up with better writing again. Episode 6 gave us Astro Tessa, who I think was a very interesting character. She has a lot of personality that a lot of viewers liked. However, instead of just having an interesting personality, Liam did an amazing job of making her morally complex as well. Tessa wants to kill all the drones infected with a solver to, get rid of the threat of Sin possessing them, which makes her morally complex in a way viewers can understand and relate to. This also creates a moral dilemma for N that he has to work through, developing his character along with his interactions with Uzi. Overall, though, Astro Tessa is written extremely well and is just really interesting. And it plays into the twist in episode 7. On top of this, Uzi continues to be a gremlin, but finally calms down a little bit in this episode, which makes me like her a little bit more. She shows this character progression into being a slightly calmer character, and she also shows how she's learned to control her powers at the beginning of the episode a little bit more again. And then the possession kicks in, obviously, which is both scary and really cool. It digs deeper into lore, but also works towards finishing her Solver arc. Also, her and N were really cute in this episode, which I can't believe I'm saying because I'm not a guy who's into romance. But the holding hands scene was really cute. Also, her hugging N after she wakes up was something that made me feel, which I normally don't do in emotional scenes like that. Now, the other main character here is V, and while her sacrifice is controversial, I do think it was decently well written. even without episode 8, I've always seen kind of tying it all together. It was shown throughout the series that she was slowly becoming softer and her trust in others was growing. I can get into it more at a different time, but her sacrifice hits hard regardless, and I don't think it was that poorly written. I'm not disagreeing that the end of her character was a bit abrupt and could have been written better, but I also don't think it was as bad as some people made it out to be. Doll still gives me an issue, though. In episode 3, she was set up as such a good villain kind of character, but since then she just hasn't done anything. She was set up to play a big role, but just, like, I don't know. There was a lack of her in episodes 4 and 5, and then she finally comes back in 6 to complete her goal of getting revenge on B, but just, it's not as satisfying because we never got to see her enough to connect with her. The other problem with characters in this episode arises with the Sentinels and Alice. It's a great concept. Both these antagonists were really good, but introducing 2 new ones with only 3 episodes left in the series just doesn't really work. They really needed to pick one villain. Alice and Bo played their short roles really well. I also really like the Sentinels too, but I wish they could have done more with them. Besides having a really cool design, they were just kind of underutilized. The action wasn't overwhelming in this episode, and I thought the pacing was really good, honestly. None of the jokes were forced, and they flowed pretty naturally. It progressed the story as it needed to since the group got to enter Cabin Fever Labs. All around, honestly, really solid writing. But because of the lack of Doll doing anything continually, and just the issue of no main clear villain in this episode, I don't think I can really justify an S tier. So I'm going to give it A. Episode 7 might have been a little bit controversial where I put it. I put it in 5th place in B tier behind the first episode. I think it just did too many things for my brain to handle. And so I didn't like it as much as I probably could have if I was more understanding of the series at the time, which I was not. I only got really into lore around episode 8, if I'm being honest. Now I'm a diehard. I know everything, but that's irrelevant. So, episode 7, though, was another well-written episode. The starting flashback was really good. It was a really good way not only to hook the viewers, but gave context on why the core exploded and how Yeva and Nori got the solver and how that therefore got passed on to Uzi and Doll and how they got their abilities. It also shows why the labs are important to Sin. It's and honestly, I just think the flashback was super effective at just filling in background gaps we didn't have. Moving on to characters, I think Uzi in this episode was cool, and while her infection finally took over, she was still able to be saved, and she stayed in character the whole time, and it was part of the way of saving her was by getting her back into her angsty mode. And once again, actually had some good development. He stood up for himself and what he believed. He killed Tessa when she was threatening to kill Uzi, or he thought he killed Tessa, which is really big for him. That's not something I thought he had in him. We also saw Tessa working to complete her goals, just creating her and her versus N, that big moral complexity dilemma. Very well written. The twist also actually wasn't that bad. It was really interesting. I don't think it was that poorly written. There might have been a slight lack of foreshadowing, but her body language in previous episodes, the mannequin in episode 4, the hand, her goals aligning with what the solver's goals were, kind of all worked to foreshadow a little bit, so it wasn't too terrible. But here are the 2 problem characters again. We have 2 of them. Doll and Nori. Doll got absolutely screwed. Doll was one of my favorite characters in the entire series up until this point. I was trying to still love her, even though she still barely got a lack of screen time and just didn't get to do anything. However, here, after accomplishing her goal of killing V, apparently now has the new goal winning cure the solver, so she doesn't get infected by Sin or whatever, which is okay, I kind of get it. But then she shows up and just dies. Dude, really? It makes me angry, and I just want more justice for her character than anything. Her end just felt too sudden after a lack of doing anything, and I feel like her death should have made me feel more. But when she died, it was oh, I guess that's the end of her. I don't think abruptly ending her character was bad, because in a show like Murder Drones, you need to kill off characters sometimes abruptly. It would fit with the story. However, it needed to be a more relevant character that would really make me feel something, because they set it up in a way that felt like I really was supposed to get like my heart pulled at this or something, or like be like, oh my god, what, Doll's dead? But I just couldn't find myself to care, which was just so sad because I liked Doll so much as a character. The other problem character is Nori. Nori was a big mystery character that was brought back to life in this episode, and she brought back the USB patch, I guess, but that immediately got destroyed, so that ended up being irrelevant. And then she just power scaled the fight for Uzi versus N when Uzi was infected. But outside of that, she was just useless in this episode and the next. So she really should never have been brought back, in my opinion. The action in this episode was pretty good, though, and it was well utilized. I didn't have a problem with the pacing. The jokes weren't the best, but they also weren't the worst. We did start to wrap up the story really well in this episode, I think. A lot of pieces were falling into place, and it set up for what could have been a great episode if it could get episode 8 could wrap up the rest of them. Overall, the writing was pretty good. It completed the Tessa's plot line, revealed Sin to be wearing her corpse, setting up a good finale. It set up Uzi fighting off the Solver's possession, ruthlessly killed off a character that I should have felt more. And yes, I'm mad about this. Shut up. And honestly, it just set up an epic showdown. I don't think this episode was poorly written. It was a little bit overwhelming. It wasn't too flawed, but it had a couple, so I'm going to put it in 8s here. And here we go. Episode 8. I put this as my number 1 favorite episode, in my opinion, tier list. It was by far the most entertaining episode. It was visually brilliant, and the audio, the OSTs were amazing. But the writing. Problems. Pacing was terrible. 20 minutes wasn't long enough. The entire episode was one long fight scene. I don't necessarily hate that as a viewer, but from a writing viewpoint, it was not good. It did not wrap up any storylines. Nori didn't do anything, showing how she was brought back for literally nothing. Her reunion with Khan is a mid joke, and then ultimately we just don't even get to see when they actually meet up for real. Uzi and N finally admit they're dating, which is kind of cool, but outside of that, they're just stuck together the entire episode and don't talk to anyone else. Jay, who was set up to be have a bigger role in this, fighting maybe the B plot characters with Lizzie, Thad, and Khan. Character assassination. V comes back from the dead and saves everyone. Huge. Oh my god, what? V's not dead? She tamed a sentinel? Wow. And then Uzi and N see she's alive, and then here we see Uzi say something to V. Wow, what's she gonna say?
Glad you're not dead or whatever.
Wow, and that's all V gets. Her revival is just brushed off. The side characters that were set up to fight Jay also didn't do crap. They seemed like they were going to have a big role against Jay, and then both Jay and the side characters didn't have any payoff. I think the Raptor and Lizzie joke was pretty funny and what was all around a dark episode, though. Outside these negatives, I just want to move on. We all know what these negatives are. We've all heard people talk about them. Let's get on to the positives. So the villain in Sin, while she might not have had a clear motivation, she was brilliantly, terrifyingly written. Her ego leading to her downfall was also written very well, and the horror in this episode was amazing. Uzi's actions also actually had consequences, which is important too when you're writing, since when she eats Solver, she ends up with it in her tail. The V Volway scene saved V for many people that didn't already like her, even though I did, because they argued the episode that when she sacrificed herself was dumb. This kind of wrapped up her character, and she totally shined. Went from being kind of well written to one of the best written characters in the show. Before this, honestly, my favorite character is probably Doll or N. I really would love to say Doll, but I just can't because she got so screwed. So it probably was N. I have moved on from N now. I no longer like him nearly as much as I once did, but it quickly became V after this episode. And also, one place this episode didn't fail was keeping the viewer entertained. This is by far the most eye-catching and interesting episode, so I give it brownie points for that. There were also very little jokes to interrupt this horror, and I think that was honestly really good for this finale. As an episode 8 failed greatly in some places, and I probably would have been forced to give it B tier. However, since it's the finale, these issues are magnified tenfold. It means these problems can't be resolved, and we can't get an explanation that might save maybe Jay's character in the future for why she didn't betray Tessa or something. So we're just stuck with her being completely out of character and siding with Sin in the end. And so while this episode might have been B tier as an episode, as a finale, I think I'm forced to give it bottom C tier. It ultimately did still do more than episode 4, but it just was by far the worst written of the other 6 or 7. It hurts, it really does. To be fair, V, Uzi, and Sin were great characters in this episode. The resolution wasn't terribly written. It just had so many flaws, with side characters that were set up to do things that they didn't. Jay, horrible, horrible, horrible. And just the lack of screen time. Overall, though, this is going to be my final ranking of the writing. I would say the characters in these 4 episodes were definitely what made them stand out as S and A tiers. Character writing was very good in these episodes. They did what they needed to. They did a good job of progressing the plot forward. They did a good job of setting things up. Excluding episode 1, the comedy was pretty good in these 3. The horror was amazing in all 3 of these as well. Even the first episode had some pretty good horror. Character interactions and action was balanced out well. Pacing was pretty good. Some of these episodes are lacking the things I just stated. So, would love to hear any feedback on how you think these episodes should be ranked based on writing. This is mine. Thank you for watching this video. I appreciate it greatly. Goodbye.